Part 1, Chapter 10C of The Adventures of Jimmie Dale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. The Adventures of Jimmie Dale by Frank L. Packard. Part 1, The Man in the Case. Chapter 10C, The Alibi concluded. A single sheet, closely written on both sides of the paper, was in his hand. It was her writing. There was no mistaking that. But every word, every line, bore evidence of frantic haste. Even that customary formula, "Dear philanthropic crook," that had prefaced every line she had ever written him before, had been omitted. His eyes traversed the first few lines with that strange indifference that had settled upon him. What, after all, did it matter what it was? He could do nothing, not even save himself, probably. And then, with a little start, he read the lines over again, muttering snatches from them. Max Diestrich, diamonds, the Ross Logan stones, wedding, sliding panel in wall of workshop, end of the room near window, 10 boards to the right from side wall, press small knot in the wood in the center of the 10th board. Tonight. It brought a sudden thrill of excitement to Jimmie Dale that, impossible as he would have believed it an instant ago, for the moment overshadowed the realization of his own peril. A robbery such as that, if it were ever accomplished, would stir the country from end to end. It would set New York by the ears. It would lose the police in full cry like a pack of bloodhounds with their leashes slipped. The society columns of the newspapers had been busy for months, featuring the coming marriage of the Ross Logan's daughter to one of the country's young merchant princes. The combined fortunes of the two families would make the young couple the richest in America. The prospective groom's wedding gift was to be a diamond necklace of perfectly matched large stones that would eclipse anything of the kind in the country. Europe, the foreign markets, had been literally combed and ransacked to supply the gems. The stones had arrived in New York the day before, the duty on them alone amounting to over $50,000. All this had appeared in the papers. Jimmie Dale's brows drew together in a frown. On just exactly what percentage the duty was figured, he did not know, but it was high enough on the basis of $50,000 to assume safely that the assessed value of the stones was not less than 4 times that amount. $200,000 laid down, $250,000. Well, why not? In more than 1/4 diamonds were ranked as the soundest kind of an investment. Furthermore, through personal acquaintance with the high contracting parties who were in his own set, he knew it to be true. He shrugged the shoulders. The papers, too, had thrown the limelight on Max Diestrich, who, though for quite a time the fashion in the social world, had up to the present been comparatively unknown to the average New Yorker. His own knowledge of Max Diestrich went deeper than the superficial biography furnished by the newspapers. The old Hollander had done more than one piece of exquisite jewelry work for him. The old fellow was a character that beggared description, eccentric to the point of extravagance, and deaf as a post, but in craftsmanship a modern Cellini. He employed no workmen, lived alone over his shop on one of the lower streets between 5th and 6th Avenues near Washington Square, and possessed a splendid contempt for such protective contrivances as safes and vaults. If his prospective patrons expostulated on this score before entrusting him with their valuables, they were at liberty to take their work elsewhere. It was Mark Dextrix who honored you by accepting the commission, not you who honored Mark Dextrix by entrusting him with it. Of what use is it to me, a safe, he would exclaim. It hides nothing. It only says, I am inside. Do not look further. Come and get me. Yes, it is to explode with the nitroglycerin. Poof! And I am deaf, and I hear nothing. It is a foolishness that he had a habit of prodding at one with a leveled forefinger. Every night somewhere they are robbed. And have I been robbed? Eh? Tell me that. Have I been robbed? It was true. In 10 years, though at times having stones and precious metal aggregating large amounts deposited with him by his customers, Max District had never lost so much as the gold filings. There was a queer smile on Jimmie Dale's lips now. The knot in the 10th board was significant. Max District was scrupulously honest, a genius in originality and conception of design, a master in the perfection and delicacy of his finished work. He had been commissioned to design and set the Ross Logan necklace. The brain works quickly. All this and more had flashed almost instantaneously through Jimmie Dale's mind. His eyes fell to the letter again, and he read on. Halfway through, a sudden whiteness blanched his face, and following it, a surging tide of red that mounted to his temples. It dazed him. It seemed to rob him for the moment of the power of coherent thought. He was wrong. He had not read aright. It was incredible, daredevil beyond belief, and yet in its very audacity lay success. He finished the letter, read it once more, and his fingers mechanically began to tear it into little shreds. His brain was in a whirl, a vortex of conflicting emotions. Had Whitey Mack and Lanigan left Bristol Bob's yet? Where were they now? Was there time for this? He was staring at the little torn scraps of paper in his hand. He thrust them suddenly into his pocket and jacked out his watch. It was nearly midnight. The broad, muscular shoulders seemed to square back curiously, the jaws to clamp a little, the face to harden and grow cold until it was like stone. With a swift movement, he emptied his glass into the cuspidor, set the glass back on the table, and stepped out from the stall. His destination was Max District's. The Palace Saloon was near the upper end of the Bowery, and failing a taxicab, of which none was in sight, his quickest method was to walk, and he started briskly forward. It was not far, and it was barely 10 minutes from the time he had left the Palace Saloon when he swung through Washington Square to 5th Avenue, and a moment later turned from that thoroughfare, heading west towards 6th Avenue, along one of those streets which, with the city's northward trend, had quite lost any distinctive identity, and from being once a modestly fashionable residential section, had now become a conglomerate potpourri of small tradesmen's stores, shops, and apartments of the poorer class. He knew Marksday streets. He could well have done without the aid of the arc lamp, which, even if dimly, indicated that low, almost tumble-down two-story structure, tucked away between the taller buildings on either side, that almost engulfed it. It was late. The street was quiet. The shops and stores had long since been closed. Marksday streets among them, the old Hollander's name in painted white letters, stood out against the background of a darkened workshop window. In the story above, the lights too were out. Marksday Street was probably fast asleep, and he was stone deaf. A glance up and down the street, and Jimmie Dale was standing, or rather, leaning against Marksday Street's door. There was no one to see, and if there were, what was there to attract attention to a man standing nonchalantly for a moment in a doorway? It was only for a moment. Those master fingers of Jimmie Dale were working surely, swiftly, silently. A little steel instrument that was never out of his possession was in the lock and out again. The door opened, closed. He drew the black silk mask from his pocket and slipped it over his face. Immediately in front of him, the stairs led upward. Immediately to his right was the door into the shop. The modest street entrance was common to both. The door into the workshop was not locked. He opened it, stepped inside, and closed it quietly behind him. The place was in blackness. He stood for a moment silent, straining his ears to catch the slightest sound, reconstructing the plan of his surroundings in his mind as he remembered it. It was a narrow oblong room, running the entire depth of the building. A very long room, blank walls on either side, a window in the middle of the rear wall that gave on a backyard, and from the backyard there was access to the lane. Also, as he remembered the place, it was a riot of disorder, with workbenches and odds and ends strewn without system or reason in every direction. One had need of care to negotiate it in the dark. He took his flashlight from his pocket and, preliminary to a more intimate acquaintance with the interior, glanced out through the front window near which he stood, and with a suppressed cry, shrank back instinctively against the wall. Two men were crossing the street, heading directly for the shop door. The arc lamp lighted up their faces. It was Inspector Lannigan of headquarters and Whitey Mack. The quick intake of Jimmie Dale's breath was sucked through clenched teeth. They were close on his heels then, far closer than he had imagined. It would take Whitey Mack scarcely any longer to open that front door than it had taken him. Close on his heels. His face was rigid. He could hear them now at the door. The flashlight in his hand winked down the length of the room. It was a dangerous thing to do, but it was still more dangerous to stumble into some object and make a noise. He darted forward, circuiting a workbench, a stool, a small hand forge. Again, the flashlight gleamed. Against the side wall near the rear was another workbench with a sort of coarse canvas curtain hanging partway down in front of it, evidently to protect such things as might be stored away beneath it from dust. And Jimmie Dale sprang for it, whipped back the canvas, and crawled underneath. He was not an instant too soon. As the canvas fell back into place, the shop door opened, closed, and the two men had stepped inside. Whitey Mack's voice, in a low whisper though it was, seemed to echo raucously through the shop. Maybe we'll have a sweet wait, but I got the straight dope on this. He's going to make a try for Dutch's sparklers tonight. We'll let him go the limit, and we don't either of us make a move till he's pinched them, and then we get him with the goods on him. He can't get away. He hasn't a hope. There's only two ways of getting in here or getting out. This door and window here, and a window that's down there at the back. You guard this, and I'll take care of the other end. Savvy? Right, Lanigan answered grimly. Go ahead. There was the sound of footsteps moving forward, then a vicious bump, the scraping of some object along the floor, and a muffled curse from Whitey Mack. Use your flashlight, advised the inspector in a guarded voice. I haven't got one, damn it, growled Whitey Mack. It's all right. I'll get along. Again the steps, but more warily now, as though the man were cautiously feeling ahead of him for possible obstacles. Jimmie Dale for a moment held his breath. He could have reached out and touched the man as the other passed. Whitey Mack went on until he had taken up a position against the rear wall. Jimmie Dale heard him as he brushed against it. Then silence fell. He was between them now, stretched full length on the floor. Jimmie Dale raised the lower portion of the canvas away from in front of his face. He could see nothing. The place was in Stygian blackness, but it had been close and stifling, and at least it gave him more air. The minutes dragged by, each more interminable than the one that had gone before. Not a movement, not a sound, and then, through the stillness, very faint at first, came the regular repressed breathing of Whitey Mack, who was much the nearer of the two men, and once noticeable, almost imperceptible as it was, it seemed to pervade the room and fill it with a strange, ominous resonance that rose and fell until the blackness palpitated with it. Slowly, very slowly, Jimmie Dale's hand crept into his pocket and crept out again with his automatic. He lay motionless once more. Time in any concrete sense seemed to exist. Fancied shapes began to assume form in the darkness. By the door, Lanigan stared uneasily, shifting his position slightly. Was it hours? Was it only minutes? It seemed to ring through the nerve-wracking stillness like the shriek of a hurtling shell, and it was only a whisper. Watch yourself, Lanigan, whispered Whitey Mack. He's coming down through the yard. Don't move till I start something. Let him get his paws on the sparklers. Silence again, and then a low rasping at the window, like the gnawing of a rat. Then, inch by inch, the sash was lifted. There was a sound, as of a body forcing its way over the sill cautiously. Then a step upon the floor inside. Another, and still another. The figure of a man loomed up suddenly against the glow of a flashlight as he threw the round white ray inquisitively here and there over the rear wall. And now he appeared to be counting the boards. 1, 2, 3, up to 10. His hand ran up and down the 10th board. Again and again he repeated the operation, and something like the snarl of a baited beast echoed through the room. He half turned to snatch at something in his pocket, and the light, for a moment, showed a black-bearded, lowering face, partially hidden by a peaked cap that was pulled far down over his eyes. There was a rip and tear of rending wood as a steel Jimmie, in lieu of the spring the man evidently could not find, bit in between the boards. A muttered oath of satisfaction, and a portion of the wall slid back, disclosing what looked like a metal-lined cupboard. He reached in, seized one of a dozen little boxes, and wrenched off the cover. A blue, scintillating gleam seemed to leap out to meet the white ray of the flashlight. The man chuckled hoarsely and began to cram the rest of the boxes into his pockets. Jimmie Dale stared. On hands and knees, he was creeping now from beneath the workbench. Something caught and tore behind him the canvas curtain, and at the sound, with a sharp cry, the man at the wall whirled, the light went out, and he sprang toward the window. Jimmie Dale gained his feet and leaped forward. A revolver shot cut a lane of fire through the blackness, and above the roar of the report, Whitey Mack's voice in a fierce yell. "It's all right, Lanigan. I got him." "No, hell!" There was a terrific crash of breaking glass. "He's got away." "Not yet, he hasn't," gritted Jimmie Dale between his teeth, and his clubbed revolver swung crashing to the head of a dark form in front of him. There was a half sigh, half moan. The form slid limply to the floor. Lanigan was floundering down the shop, leaping obstacles in a mad rush, his flashlight picking out the way. Jimmie Dale stepped swiftly backward, and his hand groped out for the drop light over the end of the bench that he had knocked against in his own rush. His fingers clutched it, and the lower end of the shop was flooded with light. Except for his felt hat that lay a little distance away, there was no sign of Whitey Mack. The huddled form of the man, who but a moment since had chuckled as he pocketed old Mack's district's gems, lay sprawled inert upon the floor. And Lanigan was staring into the muzzle of Jimmie Dale's automatic. "Drop that gun, Lanigan," said Jimmie Dale coolly, "and I'll trouble you not to make a noise. It might attract attention from the street. There's been too much already. Drop that gun." The revolver clattered from Lanigan's hand to the floor. A step forward, and Jimmie Dale's toe sent it spinning under a bench. Another step, and, his revolver still covering the other, he had whipped a pair of handcuffs from the officer's side pocket. Lanigan, as though the thought had never occurred to him, offered no resistance. He was staring in a dazed sort of way back and forth from Jimmie Dale to the man on the floor. "What's this mean?" he burst out suddenly. "Where's—" "Your wrist, please," requested Jimmie Dale pleasantly. "No, the left one." "Thank you," as the handcuff snapped shut. "Now go over there and sit down on the floor beside that fellow. Quick!" Jimmie Dale's voice rasped suddenly, imperatively. Still bewildered, but a little sullen now, Lanigan obeyed. Jimmie Dale stooped quickly and snapped the other link of the handcuff over the unconscious man's right wrist. Jimmie Dale smiled. "That's the approved way of taking your man, isn't it? Left wrist to the prisoner's right. He's only stunned. He'll be around in a moment." "Know him?" Lanigan shook his head. "Take a good look at him," invited Jimmie Dale. "You ought to know most of them in the business." Lanigan bent over a little closer, and then, with an amazed cry, his free hand shot forward and tore away the other's beard. It was Whitey Mack. "My God!" gasped Lanigan. "Quite so," said Jimmie Dale evenly. "You'll find the diamonds in his pockets. And excuse me," his fingers were running through Whitey Mack's clothes. "Ah, here it is." The thin metal case was in his hand. "A little article that belongs to me, and whose loss I am free to admit caused me considerable concern until I was informed that he had only found it without having the slightest idea as to whom it belonged." It made quite a difference. He had opened the case carelessly before Lanigan's eyes. "The Gray Seal. I'll say it for you," said Jimmie Dale whimsically. This is what probably put the idea into his head after first, in some way, having discovered old Max District's hiding place. And if I'd given him time enough, he would probably have stuck one of these seals, in clumsy imitation of that little eccentricity of mine, on the wall over there, to stamp the job as genuine. You begin to get it, don't you, Lanigan? Pretty surefire as an alibi, eh? And he'd have got away with it too, as far as you were concerned. He had only to fire that shot, smash the window, tuck his false beard, mustache, and peaked cap into his pocket, put on his own hat that you see there on the floor, and yell that the man had escaped. He'd help you chase the thief too. Rather neat, don't you think, Lanigan? And what the risk too, considering the howl that would go up at the theft of those stones, and that, known as the slickest diamond thief in the country, he would be the first to be suspected, except that the police themselves, in the person of Inspector Lanigan of headquarters, would be prepared to prove a perfectly good alibi for him. Lanigan's head was thrust forward. His eyes, hard, were riveted on Whitey Mack. "My God," he said again under his breath. Then, fiercely, "He'll get his for this." It was a moment before Jimmie Dale spoke. He was musingly examining the automatic in his hand. I am going now, Lanigan, he observed quietly. I require, say, 15 minutes in which to effect my escape. It is, of course, obvious that an alarm raised by you might prove extremely awkward, but a piece of canvas from that bench there, together with a bit of string, would make a most effective gag. I prefer, however, not to submit you to that indignity. Instead, I offer you the alternative of giving me your word to remain quietly where you are for 15 minutes. Lanigan hesitated. Jimmie Dale smiled. I agree, said Lanigan shortly. Jimmie Dale stepped back. The electric light switch clicked. The place was in darkness. There was a moment or two of utter stillness. Then, softly from the front end of the shop, a whisper. If I were you, Lanigan, I'd take that gun from Whitey's pocket before he comes round and beats you to it. And the door closed silently behind Jimmie Dale. End of part 1, chapter 10C.
Part 1, Chapter 11A of The Adventures of Jimmie Dale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. The Adventures of Jimmie Dale by Frank L. Packard. Reading by Roger Moline. Part 1, The Man in the Case. Chapter 11A, The Stool Pigeon. In the subway, 10 minutes before, a freckle-faced messenger boy had squeezed himself into a seat beside Jimmie Dale, yanked a dime novel from a refractory pocket, and, blissfully lost to all the world, had buried his head in its pages. Jimmie Dale's glance at the youngster had equally, perforce, embraced the lurid title of the thriller, Dicing with Death, so imperturbably thrust under his nose. At the time he had smiled indulgently, but now, as he left the subway and headed for his home on Riverside Drive, the words not only refused to be ignored, but had resolved themselves into a curiously persistent refrain in his mind. They were exactly what they purported to be, dime novelish, of the deepest hue of yellow, melodramatic in the extreme, but also, to him now, they were grimly apt and premonitorily appropriate. Dicing with death. There was not an hour, not a moment in his day when he was not literally dicing with death. When, with the underworld and the police allied against him, a single false move would lose him the throw that left death the winner. The risk of the dual life enforced upon him grew daily greater, and in the end there must be the reckoning. He would have been a madman to have shut his eyes in the face of what was obvious. But it was worth it all, and in his soul he knew that he would not have had it otherwise, even now. Tonight, tomorrow, the day after, would come another letter from the Tocsin, and there would be another crime of the Gray Seals blazoned in the press. Would that be the last affair, or would there be another? Or tonight, tomorrow, the day after, would he be trapped before even one more letter came? He shrugged his shoulders as he ran up the steps of his house. Those were the stakes that he himself had laid on the table to wager upon the game. He had no quarrel there. But if only, before the end came, or even with the end itself, he could find her. With his latchkey he let himself into the spacious, richly furnished, well-lighted reception hall, and crossing this went up the broad staircase, his steps noiseless on the heavy carpet. Below, faintly, he could hear some of the servants. They evidently had not heard him close the door behind him. Discipline was relaxed somewhat, it was quite apparent, with Jason, that peer of butlers, away. Jason, poor chap, was in the hospital. Typhoid, they had thought it at first, though it had turned out to be some milder form of infection. He would be back in a few days now, but meanwhile he missed the old man sorely from the house. He reached the landing and, turning, went along the hall to the door of his own particular den, opened the door, closed it behind him, and in an instant the keen, agile brain, trained to the littlest things that never escaped it, that daily held his life in the balance, was alert. The room was unusually dark, even for night time. It was as though the window shades had been closely drawn, a thing Jason never did. But then Jason wasn't there. Jimmie Dale, smiling then a little quizzically at himself, reached up for the electric light switch beside the door, pressed it, and his finger still on the button, whipped his automatic from his pocket with his other hand. The room was still in darkness. The smile on Jimmie Dale's lips was gone, for his lips now had closed together in a tight, drawn line. The lights in the rest of the house, as witness the reception hall, were in order. This was no accident. Silent, motionless, he stood there, listening. Was he trapped at last in his own house? By whom? The police? The thugs of the underworld? It made little difference. The end would differ only in the method by which it was attained. What was that? Was there a slight stir, a movement at the lower end of the room? Or was it his imagination? His hand fell from the electric light switch to the doorknob behind his back. Slowly, without a sound, it began to turn under his slim, tapering fingers, whose deft, sensitive touch had made him known and feared as the master cracksman of them all. And, as, noiselessly, the door began to open. It was like a duel of silence. What was the intruder, whoever he might be, waiting for? The abortive click of the electric light switch, to say nothing of the opening of the door when he had entered, was evidence enough that he was there. Was the other trying to place him exactly through the darkness to make sure of his attack? The door was open now, and suddenly Jimmie Dale laughed easily aloud, and on the instant shifted his position. "Well?" inquired Jimmie Dale coolly from the other side of the threshold. It seemed like a long-drawn sigh fluttering through the room, a gasp of relief. And then the blood was pounding madly at his temples, and he was back in the room again, the door closed once more behind him. "Oh, Jimmie, why didn't you speak? I had to be sure that it was you." It was her voice. Hers, the Tocsin. Here. She was here. Here in his house. "You!" he cried. "You! Here!" He was pressing the electric light switch frantically, again and again. Her voice came out of the darkness from across the room. "Why are you doing that, Jimmie? You know already that I have turned off the lights." "At the sockets, of course!" He laughed out the words almost hysterically. "Your face! I have never seen your face, you know." He was moving quickly toward the reading lamp on his desk. There was a quick, hurried swish of garments, and she was blocking his way. "No," she said in a low voice. "You must not light that lamp." He laughed again, shortly, fiercely now. She was close to him. His hands reached out for her, touched her, and, thrilling at the touch, swept her toward him. "Jimmie! Jimmie, are you mad?" she breathed. Mad! Yes, he was mad with the wildest, most passionate exhilaration he had ever known. He found his voice with an effort. "These months and years that I have tried until my soul was sick to find you," he cried out. "And you are here now. Your face, I must see your face." She had wrenched herself away from him. He could hear her breath coming sharply in little gasps. He groped his way onward toward the desk. "Wait!" Her tones seemed to ring suddenly vibrant through the room. "Wait, before you touch that lamp. I put you on your honor not to light it." He stopped abruptly. "My honor?" he repeated mechanically. Yes, I came here tonight because there was no other way. No other way. Do you understand? I came, trusting to your honor not to take advantage of the conditions that forced me to do this. I had no fear that I was wrong. I have no fear now. You will not light that lamp, and you will not make any attempt to prevent my going away, as I came, unknown. Is there any question about it, Jimmie? I am in your house." "You don't know what you're saying," he burst out wildly. "I've risked my life for a chance like this again and again. I've gone through hell, living in squalor for a month on end as Larry the Bat, in the hope that I might discover who you are. And do you think I'll let anything stop me now? I tell you, no. 1,000 times no." She made no answer. There was only her low, quick breathing coming from somewhere near him. He made another step toward the lamp and stopped. "I tell you no," he said again, and took another step forward and stopped once more. Still she made no answer. A minute passed, another. His hand lifted and swept across his forehead in an agitated way. Still silence. She neither moved nor spoke. His hands dropped slowly to his side. There was a queer, twisted smile upon his lips. "You win," he said hoarsely. "Thank you, Jimmie," she said simply. "And your name, who you are." He was speaking, but he did not seem to recognize his own voice. "The 100 other things I've sworn I'd make you explain when I found you are all taboo as well, I suppose." "Yes," she said. He laughed bitterly. "Don't you know," he cried out, "that between the police and the underworld, our house of cards is likely to collapse at any minute, that they are hunting the Gray Seal day and night? It is to be always like this, that I am never to know until it is too late." She came toward him out of the darkness impulsively. "They will never get you, Jimmie," she said in a suppressed voice. "And some day, I promise you now, you shall have your reward for tonight. You shall know everything." "When?" The word came from him with fierce eagerness. "I do not know," she answered gently. "Soon, perhaps. Perhaps sooner than either of us imagine." "And by that you mean what?" he asked, and his hand reached out for her again through the blackness. This time she did not draw away. There was an instant's hesitation. Then she spoke again, hurriedly, a note of anxiety in her voice. "You are beginning all over again, aren't you, Jimmie? And I have told you that tonight I can explain nothing. And besides, it is what has brought me here that counts now, and every moment is of—" "Yes, I know," he interposed. "But then at least you will tell me one thing. Why did you come tonight, instead of sending me a letter as you always have before?" "Because it is different tonight than it ever was before," she replied earnestly. "Because there is something in what has happened that I cannot explain myself. Because there is danger, and where I could not see clearly I feared a trap, and so I dared not send what, in a letter, could at best be only vague and incomplete details. Do you see?" "Yes," said Jimmie Dale, but he was only listening in an abstracted way. If he could only see that face, so close to his! He had yearned for that with all his soul for years now. And she was here, standing beside him, and his hand was upon her arm. And here, in his own den, in his own house, he was listening to another call to arms for the Gray Seal from her own lips. Honor! Was he but a poor, quixotic fool? He had only to step to the desk and switch on the light. Why should— He steadied himself with a jerk and drew away his hand. She was in his house. "Go on," he said tersely. "Do you know, or did you ever hear of old Luther Doyle?" she asked. "No," said Jimmie Dale. Do you know a man, then, named Connie Myers?" Connie Myers. Who in the Badlands did not know Connie Myers, who boasted of the half-dozen prison sentences already to his credit? Yes, he knew Connie Myers. But strangely enough, it was not in the Badlands or as Larry the Bat that he knew the man, or that the other knew him. It was as Jimmie Dale. Connie Myers had introduced himself one night several years ago with a blackjack that had just missed its mark as the man had jumped out from a dark hallway in the East Side, and he, Jimmie Dale, had thrashed the other to within an inch of his life. He had reason to know Connie Myers, and Connie Myers had reason to remember him. "Yes," he said with a grim smile, "I know Connie Myers." "And the tenement across the street from where you live as Larry the Bat? That, of course, you know." He leaned toward her wonderingly now. "Of course," he ejaculated. "Naturally." "Listen, then, Jimmie." She was speaking quickly now. "It is a strange story. This Luther Doyle was already over 50 when, some 8 or 9 years ago, his parents died within a few months of each other, and he inherited somewhere in the neighborhood of $100,000. But the man, though harmless enough, was mildly insane, half-witted, queer, and the old couple, on account of their son's mental defects, took care to leave the money securely invested and so that he could only touch the interest. During these 8 or 9 years he has lived by himself in the same old family house where he had lived with his parents, in a lonely spot near Pelham. And he has lived in a most frugal, even miserly manner. His income could not have been less than $6,000 a year, and his expenditures could not have been more than $600. His dementia, ironically enough from the day that he came into his fortune, took the form of a most pitiable and abject fear that he would die in poverty, misery, and want, and so year after year, cashing his checks as fast as he got them, never trusting the bank with a penny, he kept hiding away somewhere in his house every cent he could scrape and save from his income, which today must amount, at a minimum calculation, to $50,000. "And," observed Jimmie Dale quietly, "Connie Myers robbed him of it, and—" "No!" Her voice was quivering with passion as she caught up his words. "Twice in the last month Connie Myers tried to rob him, but the money was too securely hidden. Twice he broke into Doyle's house when the old man was out, but on both occasions was unsuccessful in his search, and was interrupted and forced to make his escape on account of Doyle's return. Tonight, an hour ago, in an empty house on the second floor of that tenement, in the room facing the landing, old Luther Doyle was murdered." There was silence for an instant. Her hand had closed in a tight pressure on his arm. The darkness seemed to add a sort of ghastly significance to her words. "In God's name, how do you know all this?" he demanded wildly. "How do you know all these things?" "Does that matter now?" she answered tensely. "You will know that when you know the rest. Oh, don't you understand, Jimmie? There is not a moment to lose now. It was easy to lure a half-witted creature like that anywhere. It was Connie Myers who lured him to the tenement and murdered him there, but from that point, Jimmie, I am not sure of our ground. I do not know whether Connie Myers is alone in this or not, but I do know that he is going to Doyle's house again tonight to make another search for the money. There is no question but that old Doyle was murdered to give Connie Myers and his accomplices, if there are any, a chance to tear the house inside out to find the money, to give them the whole night to work in without interruption, if necessary, but Doyle dead in his own house could have interfered no more with them than Doyle dead in that tenement. Why was he lured to the tenement by Connie Myers when he could much more easily have been put out of the way in his own house? Jimmie, there is something behind this, something more that you must find out. There may be others in this besides Connie Myers. I do not know. But there is something here that I am afraid of. Jimmie, you must get that man. You must get the others, if there are others, and you must stop them from getting the money in that house tonight. Do you understand now why I have come here? I could not explain in a letter. I do not quite seem to be explaining now. It would seem as though there were no need for the Gray Seal, that simply the police should be notified. But I know, Jimmie, call it intuition, what you will, I know that there is need for us, for you tonight, that behind all this is a tragedy, deeper, blacker than even the brutal, cold-blooded murder that is already done. Her voice, in its passionate earnestness, died away, and an anger, cold, grim, remorseless, settled upon Jimmie Dale, settled as it always settled upon him at her call to arms. His brain was already at work in its quick, instant way, probing, sifting, planning. She was right. It was strange, it was more than strange that, with the added risk, the danger, the difficulty, the man should have been brought miles to be done away with in that tenement. Why? Connie Myers took form before him, the coarse features, the tawny hair that straggled across the low forehead, the shifty eyes that were an intermediate color between brown and gray, the thin lips that seemed to draw in and give the jaw a protruding, belligerent effect. And Connie Myers knew him as Jimmie Dale. It would have to be, then, as Larry the Bat, that the Gray Seal must work. That meant time to go to the sanctuary and change. "The police," he asked suddenly aloud, "they have not yet discovered the body?" "Not yet," she replied hurriedly. "And that is still another reason for haste. There is no telling when they will. See, here," she thrust a paper into his hand. "Here is a plan of old Doyle's house, and directions for finding it. You must get Connie Myers red-handed. You must make him convict himself, for the evidence through which I know him to be guilty can never be used against him. And, Jimmie, be careful. I know I am not wrong, that there is still something more behind all this. And now go, Jimmie, go. There is no time to lose." She was pushing him across the room toward the door. Go. The word seemed suddenly to bring dismay. It was she again who was dominant now in his mind. Who knew if tonight, when he was taking his life in his hands again, would not be the last? And she was here now, here beside him, where she might never be again. She seemed to divine his thoughts, for she spoke again, a strange new note of tenderness in her voice that thrilled him. "You must never let them get you, Jimmie, for my sake. It will not last much longer, it is near the end, and I shall keep my promise. But go, now, Jimmie, go." "Go?" he repeated numbly. "Go? But you?" "I?" She slipped suddenly away from him, retreating back down the room. "I will go as I came." "Wait! Listen!" he pleaded. There was no answer. She was there, somewhere back there in the darkness still. He stood hesitant at the door. It seemed that every faculty he possessed urged him back there again, to her. Could he let her escape him now, when she was so utterly in his power, she who meant everything in his life? And then, like a cold shock, came that other thought, she who had trusted to his honor. With a jerk his hand swept out, felt for the doorknob, and closed upon it. "Good night," he said heavily, and stepped out into the hall. End of Part 1, Chapter 11A. Reading by Roger Moline. Part 1, Chapter 11B of The Adventures of Jimmie Dale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. The Adventures of Jimmie Dale by Frank L. Packard. Reading by Roger Moline. Part 1. The Man in the Case. Chapter 11B. The Stool Pigeon. Continued. It seemed for a while, even after he had gained the street and made his way again to the subway, that nothing was concrete around him, that he was living through some fantastical dream. His head whirled, and he could not think rationally, and then slowly, little by little, his grip upon himself came back. She had come and gone. With the roar of the subway in his ears, its raucous note seeming to strike so perfectly in consonance with the turmoil within him, he smiled mirthlessly. After all, it was as it always was. She was gone, and ahead of him lay the chances of the night. Dicing with death. The words, unbidden, came back once more. If they were true before, they were doubly applicable now. It was different tonight from what it had ever been before, as she had said. Usually, to the smallest detail, everything was laid open, clear before him in those astounding letters. Tonight, it was vague at best. A man had been murdered. Connie Myers had committed the murder under circumstances that pointed strongly to some hidden motive behind and beyond the mere chance it afforded him to search his victim's house for the hidden cash. What was it? Jimmie Dale stared out at the black subway walls. The answer would not come. Station after station passed. At 14th Street he changed from the express to a local, got out at Astor Place, and a few minutes later was walking rapidly down the upper end of the Bowery. The answer would not come. Only the fact itself grew more and more deeply significant. The ghastly, callous fiendishness that lured an old, half-witted man to his death had Jimmie Dale in that grip of cold, merciless anger again, and there was a dull flush now upon his cheeks. Whatever it meant, whatever was behind it, one thing at least was certain. He would get Connie Myers. He was close to the Sanctuary now. It was down the next cross street. He reached the corner and turned it, heading east. But his brisk walk had changed to a nonchalant saunter. There were some people coming toward him. It was the Gray Seal now, alert and cautious. The little group passed by. Ahead, the tenement bordering on the black alleyway loomed up. The Sanctuary, with its 3 entrances and exits. The home of Larry the Bat. And across from it was that other tenement that held a new interest for him now, where, in an empty room on the 2nd floor, she had said, old Doyle still lay. Should he go there? He was thinking quickly now, and shook his head. It would take what he did not have to spare, time. It was already 10 o'clock, and granted that Connie Myers had committed the crime only a little over an hour ago, the man by this time would certainly be on his way to Doyle's house near Pelham, if, indeed, he were not already there. No, there was no time to spare. The question resolved itself simply into how long, since he had already searched twice and failed on both occasions, it would take Connie Myers to unearth old Doyle's hiding place for the money. Jimmie Dale glanced sharply around him, slipped into the alleyway, and, crouching against the tenement wall, moved noiselessly along to the side entrance. A moment more, and he had negotiated the rickety stairs with practiced, soundless tread, was inside the squalid quarters of Larry the Bat, and the door of the Sanctuary was locked and bolted behind him. Perhaps 5 minutes passed, and then, where Jimmie Dale, the millionaire, had entered, there emerged Larry the Bat, of the aristocracy and the elite of the Badlands. But instead of leaving by the side door and the alleyway, as he had entered, he went along the lower hallway to the front entrance. And here, instinctively, he paused a moment at the top of the steps, as his eyes rested upon the tenement on the opposite side of the street. It was strange that the crime should have been committed there. Something again seemed to draw him toward that empty room on the 2nd story. He had decided once that he would not go, that there was not time. But, after all, it would not take long, and there was at least the possibility of gaining something more valuable even than time from the scene of the crime itself. There might even be the evidence he wanted there that would disclose the whole of Connie Myers' game. He went down the steps and started across the street, but halfway over he hesitated uncertainly as a child's cry came petulantly from the doorway. It was dark in the street, and likewise it was one of those hot, suffocating evenings when in the crowded tenements of the poorer class, miserable enough in any case, misery was added to 100-fold for lack of a single God-given breath of air. These two facts, apparently irrelevant, caused Jimmie Dale to change his mind again. He had not noticed the woman with the baby in her arms sitting on the doorstep, but now, as he reached the curb, he not only saw but recognized her, and he swung on down the street toward the Bowery. He could not very well go in without passing her, without being recognized himself, and that was a needless risk. He smiled a little wanly. Once the crime was discovered, she would not have hesitated long before informing the police that she had seen him enter there. Mrs. Hagan was no friend of his. One could not live as he had lived, as Larry the Bat, and not see something in an intimate way of the pitiful little tragedies of the poor around him, for bad, tough, and dissolute as the quarter was, all were not degraded there, some were simply poor. Mrs. Hagan was poor. Her husband was a day laborer, often out of a job, and sometimes he drank. That was how he, Jimmie Dale, or rather Larry the Bat, had come to earn Mrs. Hagan's enmity. He had found Mike Hagan drunk one night and in the act of being arrested, and had wheedled the man away from the officer on the promise that he would take Hagan home. And he was Larry the Bat, a dope fiend, a character known to all the neighborhood, and Mrs. Hagan had laid her husband's condition to his influence and companionship. He had taken Mike Hagan home, and Mrs. Hagan had driven Larry the Bat from the door of her miserable one-room lodging in that tenement with the bitter words on her tongue that only a woman can use when shame and grief and anger are breaking her heart. He shrugged his shoulders as, back along the Bowery, he retraced his steps, but now, with the hurried shuffle of Larry the Bat where before had been the brisk, athletic stride of Jimmie Dale. At Astor Place again, he took the subway, this time to the Grand Central Station, and well within an hour from the time he had left the sanctuary, including the train journey to Pelham, he was standing in a clump of trees that fringed a deserted roadway. He had passed but a few houses once he was away from Pelham, and as well as he could judge, there was none now within a quarter of a mile of him, except this one of old Luther Doyle's that showed up black and shadowy just beyond the trees. Jimmie Dale's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the place. It was little wonder that, known to have money, an attempt to rob old Doyle should have been made in a place like this. It was even more grimly significant than ever of some deeper meaning, that in its loneliness, an ideal place for a murder, the man should have been lured from there for that purpose to a crowded tenement in the city instead. What did it mean? Why had it been done? He shook his head. The answer would not come now any more than it had come before in the subway, or in the train on the way out, when he had set his brains so futilely to solve the problem. From a survey of the house, Jimmie Dale gave attention to the details of his surroundings. The trees on either side, the open space in front, a distance of 50 yards on the road, the absence of any fence. And then, abruptly, he stole forward. There was no light to be seen anywhere about the house. Was it possible that Connie Myers was not yet there? He shook his head again impatiently. Connie Myers would not have wasted any time, as the Tocsin had said. There was always present the possibility that the crime in that tenement might be discovered at any moment. Connie Myers would have lost no time, for let the discovery be made, let the police identify the body, as they most certainly would, and they would be out here hotfoot. Jimmie Dale stood suddenly still. What did it mean? He had not thought of that before. If old Doyle had been murdered here, there would not have been even the possibility of discovery until the morning at the earliest, and Connie Myers would have had all the time he wanted. What was that sound? A low, muffled tapping, like a succession of hammer blows, came from within the house. Jimmie Dale darted forward, reached the side of the house, and dropped on hands and knees. One question at least was answered. Connie Myers was inside. The plan that she had given him showed an old-fashioned cellarway, closed by folding trap doors, that was located a little toward the rear, and in a moment, creeping along, he came upon it. His hands felt over it. It was shut, fastened by a padlock on the outside. Jimmie Dale's lips thinned a little as he took a small steel instrument from his pocket. Either through inadvertence or by intention, Connie Myers had passed up an almost childishly simple means of entrance into the house. One side of the trap door was lifted up silently, and silently closed. Jimmie Dale was in the cellar. The hammering, much more distinct now, heavy, thudding blows, came from a room in the front. The connection between the cellar and the house, as shown on the Tocsin's plan, was through another trap door in the floor of the kitchen. Jimmie Dale's flashlight played on a short, ladder-like stairway, and in an instant he was climbing upward. The sounds from the front of the house continued now without interruption. There was little fear that Connie Myers would hear anything else, even the protesting squeak of the hinges, as Jimmie Dale cautiously pushed back the trap door in the flooring above his head. An inch, 2 inches, he lifted it, and his eyes on a level with the opening now, he peered into the room. The kitchen itself was intensely dark, but through an open doorway, well to one side so that he could not see into the room beyond, there struggled a curiously faint, dim glimmer of light. And then Jimmie Dale's form straightened rigidly on the stairs. The blows stopped, and a voice, in a low growl, presumably Connie Myers, reached him. "Here, take a drive at it from the lower edge." There was no answer, save that the blows were resumed again. Jimmie Dale's face had set hard. Connie Myers was not alone in this, then. Well, the odds were a little heavier, doubled, that was all. He pushed the trap door wide open, swung himself up through the opening to the floor, and the next instant, back a little from the connecting doorway, his body pressed closely against the kitchen wall. He was staring, bewildered and amazed, into the next room. On the floor, presumably to lessen the chance of any light rays stealing through the tightly drawn window shades, burned a small oil lamp. The place was in utter confusion. The right-hand side of a large fireplace, made of rough, untrimmed stone and cement, and which occupied almost the entire end of the room, was already practically demolished, and the wreckage was littered everywhere. Part of the furniture was piled unceremoniously into one corner, out of the way, and at the fireplace itself, working with sledge and bar, were 2 men. One was Connie Myers. An ironical glint crept into Jimmie Dale's eyes. The false beard and mustache the man wore could deceive no one who knew Connie Myers, and that he should be wearing them now as he knelt holding the bar while the other struck at it seemed both uncalled for and absurd. The other man, heavily built, roughly dressed, had his back turned, and Jimmie Dale could not see his face. The puzzled frown on Jimmie Dale's forehead deepened. Somewhere in the masonry of the fireplace, of course, was where old Luther Doyle had hidden his money. That was quite plain enough, and that Connie Myers, in some way or other, had made sure of that fact was equally obvious. But how did old Luther Doyle get his money in there from time to time, as he received the interest and dividends, whose accumulation, according to the Tocsin, comprised his hoard? And how did he get it out again? "All right, that'll do," grunted Connie Myers suddenly. "We can pry this one out now. Lend a hand on the bar." The other dropped his sledge, turned sideways as he stooped to help Connie Myers, his face came into view, and with an involuntary start, Jimmie Dale crouched farther back against the wall as he stared at the other. It was Hagan, Mrs. Hagan's husband, Mike Hagan. "My God," whispered Jimmie Dale under his breath. So that was it! That the murder had been committed in the tenement was not so strange now. A surge of anger swept Jimmie Dale and was engulfed in a wave of pity. Somehow the thin, tired face of Mrs. Hagan had risen before him, and she seemed to be pleading with him to go away, to leave the house, to forget that he had ever been there, to forget what he had seen, what he was seeing now. His hands clenched fiercely. How realistically, how importunately, how pitifully she took form before him. She was on her knees, clasping his knees, imploring him, terrified. From Jimmie Dale's pocket came the black silk mask. Slowly, almost hesitantly, he fitted it over his face. Mike Hagan knew Larry the Bat. Why should he have pity for Mike Hagan? Had he any for Connie Myers? What right had he to let pity sway him? The man had gone the limit. He was Connie Myers' accomplice, a murderer. But the man was not a hardened, confirmed criminal like Connie Myers. Mike Hagan, a murderer! It would have been unbelievable but for the evidence before his own eyes now. The man had faults, brawled enough, and drank enough to have brought him several times to the notice of the police. But this! Jimmie Dale's eyes had never left the scene before him. Both men were throwing their weight upon the bar and the stone that they were trying to dislodge. They were into the heart of the masonry now, seemed to move a little. Connie Myers stood up and, leaning forward, examined the stone critically at the top and bottom, prodding it with the bar. He turned from his examination abruptly and thrust the bar into Hagan's hands. "Hold it," he said tersely. "I'll strike for a turn." Crouched, on his hands and knees, Hagan inserted the point of the bar into the crevice. Connie Myers picked up the sledge. "Lower! Bend lower!" he snapped, and swung the sledge. It seemed to go black for a moment before Jimmie Dale's eyes, seemed to paralyze all action of mind and body. There was a low cry that was more a moan, the clang of the iron bar clattering on the floor, and Mike Hagan had pitched forward on his face, an inert and huddled heap. A half laugh, half snarl purled from Connie Myers' lips as he snatched a stout piece of cord from his pocket and swiftly knotted the unconscious man's wrists together. Another instant, and picking up the bar, prying with it again, the loosened stone toppled with a crash into the grate. It had come sudden as the crack of doom, that blow, too quick, too unexpected for Jimmie Dale to have lifted a finger to prevent it. And now that the first numbed shock of mingled horror and amazement was past, he fought back the quick, fierce impulse to spring out on Connie Myers. Whether the man was killed or only stunned, he could do no good to Mike Hagan now, and there was Connie Myers. He was staring in a fascinated way at Connie Myers. Behind the stone that the other had just dislodged was a large, hollow space that had been left in the masonry, and from this now Connie Myers was eagerly collecting handfuls of banknotes that were rolled up into the shape of little cylinders, each one grotesquely tied with a string. The man was feverishly excited, muttering to himself, running from the fireplace to where the table had been pushed aside with the rest of the furniture, dropping the curious little rolls of money on the table, and running back for more. And then, having apparently emptied the receptacle, he wriggled his body over the dismantled fireplace, stuck his head into the opening, and peered upward. "Kinks in his hut! Kinks in his hut!" Connie Myers was muttering. "I'll drop the bar through from the top. Maybe there's some got stuck in the pipe." He regained his feet, picked up the bar, and ran with it into what was evidently the front hall, then his steps sounded running upstairs. Like a flash, Jimmie Dale was across the room and at the fireplace. Like Connie Myers, he, too, put his head into the opening, and then, a queer, unpleasant smile on his lips, he bent quickly over the man on the floor. Hagan was no more than stunned, and was even then beginning to show signs of returning consciousness. There was a rattle, a clang, a thud, and the bar, too long to come all the way through, dropped into the opening and stood upright. Connie Myers' footsteps sounded again, returning on the run, and Jimmie Dale was back once more on the other side of the kitchen doorway. It was all simple enough, once one understood. The same queer smile was still flickering on Jimmie Dale's lips. There was no way to get the money out except the way Connie Myers had got it out, by digging it out. With the irrational cunning of his mad brain that had put the money even beyond his own reach, old Doyle had built his fireplace with a hollow some 18 inches square in a great wall of solid stonework, and from it had run a 2-inch pipe up somewhere to the story above, and down this pipe he had dropped his little stirring-tide cylinders of banknotes, satisfied that his hoard was safe. There seemed something pitifully ironic in the elaborate, insane craftiness of the old man's fear-twisted, demented mind. And now Connie Myers was back in the room again, and again a puzzled expression settled upon Jimmie Dale's face as he watched the other. For perhaps a minute the man stood by the table sifting the little rolls of money through his fingers gloatingly. Then, impulsively, he pushed these to one side, produced a revolver, laid it on the table, and from another pocket took out a little case which, as he opened it, Jimmie Dale could see contained a hypodermic syringe. One more article followed the other two, a letter which Connie Myers took out of an unsealed envelope. He dropped this suddenly on the table as Mike Hagan, 3 feet away on the floor, groaned and sat up. End of Part 1, Chapter 11B. Recording by Roger Moline. Part 1, Chapter 11C of The Adventures of Jimmie Dale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. The Adventures of Jimmie Dale by Frank L. Packard. Reading by Roger Moline. Part 1, The Man in the Case. Chapter 11C. The Stool Pigeon. Concluded. Hagan's eyes swept, bewildered, confused, around him, questioningly at Connie Myers, and then, resting suddenly on his bound wrists, they narrowed menacingly. "Damn you, you smashed me with that sledge on purpose," he burst out, and began to struggle to his feet. With a brutal chuckle, Connie Myers pushed Hagan back and shoved his revolver under the other's nose. "Sure," he admitted evenly. "And you keep quiet, or I'll finish you now, instead of letting the police do it." He laughed out jarringly. "You're under arrest, you know, for the murder of Luther Doyle and for robbing the poor old nut of his savings in his house here." Hagan wrenched himself up on his elbow. What do you mean?" he stammered. "Oh, don't worry," said Connie Myers maliciously. "I'm not making the arrest. I'd rather the police did that. I'm not mixing up in it, and by, he lifted up the hypodermic for Hagan to see, I'm going to shoot a little dope into you that'll keep you quiet while I get away myself." Hagan's face had gone a grayish white. He had caught sight of the money on the table, and his eyes kept shifting back and forth from it to Myers' face. "Murder," he said huskily. "There is no murder. I don't know who Doyle is. You said this house was yours. You hired me to come here. You said you were going to tear down the fireplace and build another. You said I could work evenings and earn some extra money." "Sure I did." There was a vicious leer now on Connie Myers' lips. "But you don't think I picked you out by accident, do you? Your reputation, my bucko, was just shady enough to satisfy anybody that it wouldn't be beyond you to go the limit. Sure, you murdered Doyle. Listen to this." He took up the letter. To the police. Luther Doyle was murdered this evening in the tenement at 67 Blank Street. You'll find his body in a room on the second floor. If you want to know who did it, look in Mike Hagan's room on the floor above. There's a paper stuck under the edge of Hagan's table with a piece of chewing gum where he hid it. You'll know what it is when you go out and take a look at Doyle's house in Pelham. Yours truly, a friend. Mike Hagan did not speak. His lips were twitching, and there was horror creeping into his eyes. "Do you get me?" sneered Connie Myers. "Tell your story. Who'd believe it? I got you cinched. Twice I tried to get this old dub's coin out here and couldn't find it. But the second time I found something else. A piece of paper with a drawing of the fireplace on it, and a place in the drawing marked with an X. That was good enough, wasn't it? That's the paper I stuck under your table this afternoon when your wife was out, see? Somebody's got to stand for the job, and if it's somebody else, it won't be me. Get me? When I had a look at that fireplace, I knew I couldn't do the job alone in a week, and I didn't dare blast it with soup for fear of spoiling what was inside. And since I had to have somebody help me, I thought I might as well let him help me all the way through, and stand for it. I picked you, Mike. That's why I croaked old Doyle in your tenement tonight. I wrote this letter while I was waiting for you to show up at the station to come out here with me, and I'm going to see that the police get it in the next hour. When they find Doyle in the room below yours, and that paper in your room, and the busted fireplace here, I guess they won't look any farther for who did it. And say," he leaned forward with an ugly grin, "maybe you think I'm soft to be telling you all this? But don't you fool yourself. You don't know me. You don't know who I am. So tell 'em the truth. They won't believe you anyway with evidence like that against you, and the neater the story, the more they'll think it shows brains enough on your part to have pulled a job like this." "My God!" Hagan was rocking on his knees. Beads of sweat were starting out on his forehead. "You wouldn't plant a man like that," he cried brokenly. "You wouldn't do it, would you? My God, you wouldn't do that!" Jimmie Dale's face, under his mask, was white and rigid. There was something primal, elemental in the savagery that was sweeping upon him. He had it all now, all. She had been right. There was need tonight for the Gray Seal. So that was the game, inhuman, hellish, the whole of it, to the last filthy dregs. Connie Myers, to protect himself, was railroading an innocent man to death for the crime that he himself had committed. There was a cold smile on Jimmie Dale's lips now as he took his automatic from his pocket. No, it wasn't quite all the game. There was still his hand to play. He edged forward a little nearer to the door and halted abruptly, listening. An automobile had stopped outside on the road. Hagan was still pleading in a frenzied way. Connie Myers was callously folding his letter while he watched the other warily. Neither of the men had heard the sound. And then, quick, almost on the instant, came a rush of feet, a crash upon the front door, an imperative command to open in the name of the law. The police! Jimmie Dale's brain was working now with lightning speed. Somehow the police had stumbled upon the crime in that tenement, and, as he had foreseen in such an event, had identified Doyle. But they could not be sure that anyone was present here in the house now. They could not see a light any more than he had. He must get Mike Hagan away, must see that Connie Myers did not get away. Myers was on his feet now, fear struck in his turn. The letter clutched in a tight-closed fist, his revolver swung out, poised, in the other hand. Hagan, too, was on his feet, and, unheeded now by Connie Myers, was wrenching his wrists apart. Another crash upon the door, another demand in a harsh voice to open it. Then someone running around to the window at the side of the house, and Jimmie Dale sprang forward. There was the roar of a report, a blinding flash almost in Jimmie Dale's eyes, as Connie Myers, whirling instantly at his entrance, fired and missed. It happened quick then, in the space of the ticking of a watch, before Jimmie Dale, flinging himself forward, had reached the man. Like a defiant challenge to their demand, it must have seemed to the officers outside, that shot of Connie Myers at Jimmie Dale, for it was answered on the instant by another through the side window. And the shot, fired at random, the interior of the room hidden from the officers outside by the drawn shades, found its mark, and Connie Myers, a bullet in his brain, pitched forward, dead, upon the floor. "Quick!" Jimmie Dale flung at Hagan. "Get that letter out of his hand!" He jumped for the lamp on the floor, extinguished it, and turned again toward Hagan. "Have you got it?" he whispered tensely. "Yes," said Hagan in a numbed way. "This way, then." Jimmie Dale caught Hagan's arm and pulled the other across the room and into the kitchen to the trap door. "Quick!" he breathed again. "Get down there, quick, and no noise. They don't know how many are in the house. When they find him, they'll probably be satisfied." Hagan, stupefied, dazed, obeyed mechanically, and in an instant the trap door closed behind them. Jimmie Dale was standing beside the other in the cellar. "Not a sound now," he cautioned once more. His flashlight winked, went out, winked again, then held steadily, in curious fascination it seemed, as in its circuit the ray fell upon Hagan, fell upon the torn, ragged edge of a paper in Hagan's hand. With a suppressed cry, Jimmie Dale snatched it away from the other. It was but a torn half of the letter. "The other half! The other half! Hagan, where is it?" he demanded hoarsely. Hagan, almost in a state of collapse, muttered inaudibly. The crash of a toppling door sounded from above. Jimmie Dale shook the man desperately. "Where is it?" he repeated fiercely. He was holding it tight. It tore in his hand," Hagan stammered. "Does it make any difference? Oh, let's get out of here, whoever you are. For God's sake, let's get out of here." Any difference? Jimmie Dale's jaws were clamped like a steel vise. Any difference? The difference between life and death for the man beside him, that was all. He was reading the portion in his hand. It was the last part of the letter, beginning with, "There's a paper stuck under the edge of Hagan's table." From above, from the floor of the front room now, came the rush and trample of feet. He could not go back for the other half, and any attempt to conceal the fact that Connie Myers had been alone in the house was futile now. They would find the torn letter in the dead man's hand, proof enough that someone else had been there. What was in that part of the letter that was still clutched in that death grip upstairs? A sentence from it, that he had heard Connie Myers read, seemed to burn itself into his brain. "If you want to know who did it, look in Mike Hagan's room on the floor above." And then, suddenly, like light through the darkness, came a ray of hope. He pulled Hagan to the cellarway, and stealthily lifted one side of the double trap door. There was a chance, desperate enough, 1 in 1,000, but still a chance. Voices from the house came plainly now, but there was no one in sight. The police, to a man, were evidently all inside. From the road in front showed the lamp glare of their automobile. "Run for the car!" Jimmie Dale jerked out from between the set teeth, and with Hagan beside him, steadying the man by the arm, dashed across the intervening 50 yards. They had not been seen. A minute more, and the car, evidently belonging to the local police, for it was headed in the direction of New York, and as though it had come from Pelham, swept down the road, swept around a turn, and Jimmie Dale, with a gasp of relief, straightened up a little from the wheel. How much time had he? The police must have heard the car. But equally occupied as they were, they might well give it no thought other than that it was but another car passing by. There was no telephone in the house. The nearest house was a quarter of a mile away, and that might or might not have a telephone. Could he count on half an hour? He glanced anxiously at the crouched figure beside him. He would have to. It was the only chance. They would telephone the contents of the dead man's half of the letter to the New York police. Could he get to Hagan's room first? "Look in Hagan's room," their part of the letter read. but it did not say for what, or exactly where. If they found nothing, Hagan was safe. Connie Myers' reputation, the fact that he was found in disguise at Doyle's house, was, barring any incriminating evidence, quite enough to let Hagan out. There would only remain in the minds of the police the question of who, beside Connie Myers, had been in old Doyle's house that night. And now Jimmie Dale smiled a little whimsically. Well, perhaps he could answer that, and if not quite to the satisfaction of the police, at least to the complete vindication of Mike Hagan. But he could not drive through towns and villages with a mask on his face, and there, ahead now, lights were beginning to show. And more than ever now, with what was before him, it was imperative that Mike Hagan should not recognize Larry the Bat. Jimmie Dale glanced again at Hagan and slowed down the car. They were on the outskirts of a town, and off to the right he caught the twinkling lights of a streetcar. "Hagan," he said sharply, "pull yourself together and listen to me. If you keep your mouth shut, you've nothing to fear. If you let out a word of what's happened tonight, you'll probably go to the chair for a crime you know nothing about. Do you understand? Keep your mouth shut." The car had stopped. Hagan nodded his head. "All right, then. You get out here and take a streetcar into New York," continued Jimmie Dale crisply. "But when you get there, keep away from your home for the next 2 or 3 hours. Hang around with some of the boys you know, and if you're asked anything afterwards, say you were batting around town all evening. Don't worry, you'll find you're out of this when you read the morning papers. Now get out. Hurry!" He pushed Hagan from the car. "I've got to make my own getaway." Hagan, standing in the road, brushed his hand bewilderingly across his eyes. "Yes, but Never mind about that." Jimmie Dale leaned out and gripped Hagan's arm impressively. "There's only one thing you've got to think of, or remember. Keep your mouth shut. No matter what happens, keep your mouth shut, if you want to save your neck. Good night, Hagan." The car was racing forward again. It shot streaking through the streets of the town ahead, and, dully over its own inferno, echoed shouts, cries, and execrations of an outraged populace, then out into the night again, roaring its way toward New York. He had half an hour, perhaps. It was a good thing Hagan did not know, or had not grasped the significance of that torn letter. The man would have been unmanageable with fear and excitement. It would puzzle Hagan to find no paper stuck under his table when he came to look for it, but that was a minor consideration. That mattered not at all. Half an hour. On roared the car. Towns, black roads, villages, wooded lands were kaleidoscopic in their passing. Half an hour. Had he done it? Had he come anywhere near doing it? He did not know. He was in the city at last, and now he had to moderate his speed. But by keeping to the less frequented streets, he could still drive at a fast pace. One piece of good fortune had been his. The long motor coat he had found in the car with which to cover the rags of Larry the Bat, and without which he would have been obliged to leave the car somewhere on the outskirts of the city, and to trust, like Mike Hagan, to other and slower means of transportation. Blocks away from Hagan's tenement, he ran the car into a lane, slipped off the motor coat, and from his own pocket whipped out the little metal insignia case, and in another moment a diamond-shaped gray seal was neatly affixed to the black ebony rim of the steering wheel. He smiled ironically. It was necessary, quite necessary, that the police should have no doubt as to who had been in Doyle's house with Connie Myers that night, or to whom they had so considerately loaned their automobile. He was running now, through lanes, dodging down side streets, taking every short cut he knew. Had he beaten the police to Mike Hagan's room? It would be easy then. If they were ahead of him then, by some means or other, he must still get that paper first. He was at the tenement now, shuffling leisurely up the steps. The front door was open. He entered and went up the first flight of stairs, then along the hall, and up the next flight. He had half expected the place to be bustling with excitement over the crime, But the police evidently had kept the affair quiet, for he had seen no one since he had entered. But now, as he began to mount the third flight, he went more slowly. Someone was ahead of him. It was very dark. He could not see. The steps above died away. He reached the landing, started along for Hagan's room, and a light blazed suddenly in his face, and a hard, quick grip on his shoulder forced him back against the wall. Then the flashlight wavered, glistened on brass buttons went out, and a voice laughed roughly. "It's only Larry the Bat." "Larry the Bat, eh?" It was another voice, harsh and curt. "What are you doing here?" He was not first, after all. The telephone message from Pelham, it was almost certainly that, had beaten him. They were ahead of him, just ahead of him. They had only been a few steps ahead of him going up the stairs, just a second ahead of him on their way to Hagan's room. Jimmie Dale was thinking fast now. He must go, too, to Hagan's room with them, somehow. There was no other way. There was Hagan's life at stake. "Aw, I ain't done nothin'," he whined. "I was just goin' to borrow the price of a feed from Mike Hagan. Lemme go." "Hagan, eh?" snapped the questioner. "Are you a friend of his?" "Sure I am." The officers whispered for a moment together. "We'll try it," decided the one who appeared to be in command. "We're in the dark anyhow, and the thing may be only a steer. Maybe it'll work. Anyway, it won't do any harm." His hand fell heavily on Jimmie Dale's shoulder. "Mrs. Hagan know you?" brusquely. "Sure she does," sniffled Larry the Bat. "Good," rasped the officer. "Well, we'll make the visit with you. And you do what you're told, or we'll put the screws on you, see? We're after something here, and you've blown the whole game, savvy? You've spilled the gravy. Understand?" In the darkness, Jimmie Dale smiled grimly. It was far more than he had dared to hope for. They were playing into his hands. "But I don't know about any game," groveled Larry the Bat piteously. "Who in hell said you did?" growled the officer. "You're supposed to have snitched the lay to us, that's all, and mind you, play your part. Come on." It was 2 doors down the hall to Mike Hagan's room, and there one of the officers, putting his shoulder to the door, burst it open and sprang in. The other shoved Jimmie Dale forward. It was quickly done. The 3 were in the room. The door was closed again. Came a cry of terror out of the darkness, a movement as of someone rising up hurriedly in bed, and then Mrs. Hagan's voice. "What is it? Who is it? Mike!" The table. It was against the right-hand wall, Jimmie Dale remembered. He sidled quickly toward it. "Strike a light," ordered the officer in charge. Jimmie Dale's fingers were feeling under the edge of the table. A quick sweep along it. Nothing. He stooped, reaching farther in. Another sweep of his arm, and his fingers closed on a sheet of paper and a piece of hard gum. In an instant they were in his pocket. A match crackled and flared up. A lamp was lighted. Larry the Bat sulked sullenly against the wall. Terror-stricken, wide-eyed, Mrs. Hagan had clutched the child lying beside her to her arms and was sitting bolt upright in bed. "Now then, no fuss about it," said the officer in charge, with brutal directness. "You might as well make a clean breast of Mike's share in that murder downstairs. Larry the Bat here has already told us the whole story. Come on now, out with it." "Murder?" Her face went white. "My Mike? Murder?" She seemed for an instant stunned, and then down the worn, thin, haggard face gushed the tears. "I don't believe it!" she cried. "I don't believe it!" "Come on now, cut that out," prodded the officer roughly. "I tell you, Larry the Bat here has opened everything up wide. You're only making it worse for yourself." "Him?" She was staring now at Jimmie Dale. "Oh, God!" she cried. "So that's what you are! Are you a stool pigeon for the cops? Well, whatever you told them, you lie. You're the curse of this neighborhood, you are, and if my Mike is bad at all, it's you that helped to make him bad. But murder? You lie!" She had risen slowly from the bed, a gaunt, pitiful figure, pitifully clothed, the black hair, gray-streaked, streaming thinly over her shoulders, still clutching the baby that, too, was crying now. The officers looked at one another and nodded. "Guess she's handling it straight. We'll have a look on our own hook," the leader muttered. She paid no attention to them. She was walking straight to Jimmie Dale. "It's you, is it?" she whispered fiercely through her sobs. "That would bring more shame and ruin here. You that's selling my man's life away with your filthy lies for what they're paying you? It's you, is it, that—" Her voice broke. There was a frightened, uneasy look in Larry the Bat's eyes. His lips were twitching weakly, he drew far back against the wall, and then, glancing miserably at the officers, as though entreating their permission, began to edge toward the door. For a moment she watched him, her face white with outrage. Her hand clenched at her side, and then she found her voice again. "Get out of here," she said in a choked, strained way, pointing to the door. "Get out of here, you dirty skate!" "Sure," mumbled Larry the Bat, his eyes on the floor. "Sure," he mumbled, and the door closed behind him. End of Part 1, Chapter 11C. Recording by Roger Moline. Part 2, Chapter 1 of The Adventures of Jimmie Dale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Adventures of Jimmie Dale by Frank L. Packard. Recording by Roger Moline. Part 2, The Woman in the Case. Chapter 1, Below the Deadline. Whisperings, always whisperings. Low, sibilant, floating errantly from all sides until they seemed a component part of the drug-laden atmosphere itself. And occasionally another sound, the soft slap, slap of loose-slippered feet, the faint rustle of equally loose-fitting garments. And everywhere the sweet, sickish smell of opium. It was Chang Foo's, simply a cellar or two deeper in Chang Foo's than that in which Dago Jim had quarreled once, and died. Larry the Bat, vicious-faced, unkempt, disreputable, lay sprawled out on one of the dive's bunks, an opium pipe beside him. But Larry the Bat was not smoking. Instead, his ear was pressed closely against the boarding that formed the rather flimsy partition at the side of the bunk. One heard many things in Chang Foo's if one cared to listen, if one could first win one's way through the carefully guarded gateway that to the uninitiated offered nothing more interesting than the entrance to a Chinese tea shop, and an uninviting one at that. Had he been followed in here? He had been shadowed for the last hour, of that at least he was certain. Why? By whom? For an hour he had dodged in and out through the dens of the underworld, as only one who was at home there and known to all could do, and at last he had taken refuge in Chang Foo's like a fox burrowing deep into its hole. Few could find their way into the most infamous opium den in all New York, where not only the poppy ruled as master, but where crime was hatched, aye, and carried to its ghastly consummation sometimes as well. And of those few, not one but was of the underworld itself, and it was that fact which held his muscles strained and rigid now under the miserable rags that covered them, and it was that which kept the keen, quick brain alert and active, every faculty keyed up and tense. If it were the police, he had little to fear, for they could not force their way in without warning. But if it were the underworld, he was in imminent peril, and had done little better than run himself into a trap from which there was no escape. Death to the Gray Seal. He had heard that whispered more than once in this very place. Who knew at what moment the role of Larry the Bat would be uncovered, and the underworld, where now he held so high a place, would be at his throat like a pack of snarling wolves? Who had been shadowing him during the last hour? Whisperings. Nothing tangible. He could catch no words, only the never-ending whisperings of gathered groups here and there, and sometimes the clink of coin where some game was in progress. The curtain before his bunk was drawn suddenly aside, and Larry the Bat's fingers, where his hand was carelessly hidden by his body, tightened upon his automatic. "Smoky some more?" The fingers relaxed. It was only Sam Wah, one of the attendants. "Nix," said Larry the Bat, in a slightly muddled tone. "Got enough." The curtain fell into place again. Larry the Bat's lips set in a thin smile. Ultimately, it made little difference whether it was the police or the underworld. The smile grew thinner. It was the flip of a coin, that was all. With one there was the death house at Sing Sing for the Gray Seal. With the other, well, there were many ways, from a shot or a knife thrust in the open street, to his murder in some hidden dive like this of Chang Foo's, for instance, where he now was. The Gray Seal was responsible for the occupancy of too many penitentiary cells by those of the underworld to look for any other fate. He raised himself up sharply on his elbow. A shrill, high note like the scream of a parakeet rang out a second time. He tore the curtain aside and jumped to his feet. All around him, in the twinkling of an eye, Chinamen in fluttering blouses, chattering like magpies, mingled with snarling, cursing whites, were running madly. A voice, prefaced with an oath, bawled out behind him as he sprang forward and joined the rush. "Beat it! The cops! Beat it!" The police! A raid! Was it for him? From rooms, an amazing number of them, more forms rushed out, joined, divided, separated, and dashed some this way, some that, along branching passageways. There had been raids before. The police had begun to change their minds about Chang Foo's, but Chang Foo's was not an easy place to raid. House after house in that quarter of Chinese laundries, of tea shops, of chop suey joints, opened one into the other through secret passages in the cellars. Larry the Bat plunged down a staircase and halted in the darkness of a cellar, drawing back against the wall while the flying feet of his fellow fugitives scurried by him. Was it for him, this raid? If not, the police had not a hope of getting him if he kept his head, for back in Chang Foo's proper, which would be quite closed off now, Chang Foo would be blandly submitting to arrest, offering himself as a sort of glorified sacrifice while the police confiscated opium and Fantan layouts. If the police had no other purpose than that in mind, Chang Foo would simply pay a fine. The next night the place would be in full blast again, and Chang Foo, higher than ever in the confidence of the underworld's aristocracy, would reap his reward, and that would be all there was to it. But was that all? The raid had followed significantly close upon the heels of his entry into Chang Foo's. Larry the Bat began to move forward again. He dared not follow the others, and later on, when quiet was restored, issue out into the street from any one of the various houses in which he might temporarily have taken refuge. There was a chance in that, a chance that the police might be more zealous than usual, even if he particularly was not their game, and he could take no chance. Arrest for Larry the Bat, even on suspicion, could have but one conclusion, not a pleasant one. The disclosure that Larry the Bat was not Larry the Bat at all, but Jimmie Dale, the millionaire clubman, and to complete a fatal triplication, that Larry the Bat and Jimmie Dale was the Gray Seal upon whose head was fixed a price. All was silence around him now, except that from overhead came occasionally the muffled tread of feet. He felt his way along into a black narrow passage, emerged into a second cellar, swept the place with a single circling gleam from a pocket flashlight, passed a stairway that led upward, reached the opposite wall, and dropping on hands and knees crawled into what innocently enough appeared to be the opening of a coal bin. He knew Chang Foo's well, as he knew the ins and outs of every den and place he frequented, knew them as a man knows such things when his life at any moment might hang upon his knowledge. He was in another passage now, and this, in a few steps, brought him to a door. Here he halted and stood for a full 5 minutes, absolutely motionless, absolutely still, listening. There was nothing, not a sound. He tried the door cautiously. It was locked. The slim, sensitive, tapering fingers of Jimmie Dale, unrecognizable now in the grimy digits of Larry the Bat, felt tentatively over the lock. To fingers that seemed in their tips to possess all the human senses, that time and again in their delicate touch upon the dial of a safe had mocked at human ingenuity and driven the police into impotent frenzy, this was a pitiful thing. From his pocket came a small steel instrument that was quickly and deftly inserted in the keyhole. There was a click. The door swung open, and Jimmie Dale, alias Larry the Bat, stepped outside into a backyard half a block away from the entrance to Chang Foo's. Again he listened. There did not appear to be any unusual excitement in the neighborhood. From open windows above him and from adjoining houses came the ordinary, commonplace sounds of voices talking and laughing, even the queer, weird notes of a Chinese chant. He stole noiselessly across the yard, out into the lane, and made his way rapidly along to the cross street. In a measure now he was safe, but one thing, a very vital thing, remained to be done. It was absolutely necessary that he should know whether he was the quarry that the police had been after in the raid, if it was the police who had been shadowing him all evening. If it was the police, there was but one meaning to it. Larry the Bat was known to be the Gray Seal, and a problem perilous enough in any aspect confronted him. Dare he risk the sanctuary for the clothes of Jimmie Dale? Or was it safer to burglarize, as he had once done before, his own mansion on Riverside Drive? His thoughts were running riot, and he frowned, angry with himself. There was time enough to think of that when he knew that it was the police against whom he had to match his wits. Well in the shadow of the buildings, he moved swiftly along the side street until he came to the corner of the street on which, halfway down the block, fronted Chang Foo's tea shop. A glance in that direction, and Jimmie Dale drew a breath of relief. A patrol wagon was backed up to the curb, and a half-dozen officers were busy loading it with what was evidently Chang Foo's far from meager stock of gambling appurtenances, while Chang Foo himself, together with Sam Wah and another attendant, were in the grip of two other officers, waiting possibly for another patrol wagon. There was a crowd, too, but the crowd was at a respectful distance, on the opposite side of the street. Jimmie Dale still hugged the corner. A man swaggered out from a doorway, quite close to Chang Foo's, and came on along the street. As the other reached the corner, Jimmie Dale sidled forward. "Hello, Chick," he said, out of the corner of his mouth. "What's the lay?" "Hello, Larry," returned the caller. Nothing. The nutcracker on Chang, that's all." "I thought maybe they was looking for some guy that was in there," observed Jimmie Dale. "Nothing doing," the other answered. "I was in there myself. The whole mob beat it clean, and the bulls never batted an eye. Didn't youse Pipe make me get away outside Shanghai's a minute ago? The bulls never went nowhere except into Chang's. There's a new lieutenant in the precinct inaugurating himself, that's all. So long, Larry, I got a date." "So long, Chick," responded Jimmie Dale, and started slowly back along the cross street. It was not the police, then, who were interested in his movements. Then who? He shook his head with a little savage, impotent gesture. One thing was clear. It was too early to risk a return to the sanctuary and attempt the rehabilitation of Jimmie Dale. If anyone was on the hunt for Larry the Bat, The sanctuary would be the last place to be overlooked. He turned the next corner, hesitated a moment in front of a garishly lighted dance hall, and finally shuffled in through the door, made his way across the floor, nodding here and there to the elite of gangland, and with a somewhat arrogant air of proprietorship, sat down at a table in the corner. Little better than a tramp in appearance, certainly the most disreputable-looking object in the place. Even the waiter who approached him accorded him a certain curious deference. Was not Larry the Bat the most celebrated dope fiend below the deadline? "Give me a mug of suds," ordered Jimmie Dale, and sprawled royally back in his chair. Under the rim of his slouch hat, pulled now far over his eyes, he searched the faces around him. If he had been asked to pick the actors for a revel from the scum of the underworld, he could not have improved upon the gathering. There were perhaps 100 men and women in the room, the majority dancing, and with the exception of a few sightseeing slummers, they were men and women whose acquaintance with the police was intimate, but not cordial, far from cordial. Jimmie Dale shrugged his shoulders and sipped at the glass that had been set before him. It was grimly ironic that he should be, not only there, but actually a factor and a part of the underworld's intimate life. He, Jimmie Dale, a wealthy man, a member of New York's exclusive clubs, a member of New York's most exclusive society. It was inconceivable. He smiled sardonically. Was it? Well, then it was none the less true. His life unquestionably was one unique, apart from any other man's, but it was, for all that, actual and real. There had been 3 years of it now, since she had come into his life. Jimmie Dale slouched down a little in his chair. The ice was thin, perilously thin, that he was skating on now. Each letter, with its demand upon him to match his wits against police or underworld, or against both combined, perhaps, made that peril a little greater, a little more imminent, if that were possible, when already his life was almost literally carried daily, hourly, in his hand. Not that he rebelled against it. It was worth the price that some day he expected he must pay, the price of honor, wealth, a name disgraced, ruin, death. Was he quixotic? Immoderately so? He smiled gravely. Perhaps. But he would do it all over again if the choice were his. There were those who blessed the name of the Gray Seal as well as those who cursed it. And there was the Tocsin. Who was she? He did not know, but he knew that he had come to love her, come to care for her, and that she had come to mean everything in life to him. He had never seen her, to know her face. He had never seen her face, but he knew her voice. Aye, he had even held her for a moment, the moment of wildest happiness he had ever known, in his arms. That night when he had entered his library, his own particular den in his own house, and in the darkness had found her there, found her finally through no effort of his own, when he had searched so fruitlessly for years to find her, using every resource at his command to find her. And she, because she had come of her own volition, relying upon him, had held him in honor to let her go as she had come, without looking upon her face. Exquisite irony. But she had made him a promise then, that the work of the Gray Seal was nearly over, that soon there would be an end to the mystery that surrounded her. That he should know all, that he should know her. He smiled again, but it was a twisted smile on the mechanically misshapen lips of Larry the Bat. Nearly over. Who knew? That nearly might be too late. Even tonight he had been shadowed, was skulking even now in this place as a refuge. Who knew? Another hour and the newsboys might be shrieking their "Extra! Extra! The Gray Seal caught! The millionaire Jimmie Dale, the Jekyll and Hyde of real life!" Jimmie Dale straightened up suddenly in his seat. There was a shout, an oath bawled out high above the riot of noise, a chorus of feminine shrieks from across the room. What was the matter with the underworld tonight? He seemed fated to find nothing but centers of disturbance. First a raid at Chang Foo's, and now this. What was the matter here? They were stampeding toward him from the other side of the room. There was the roar of a revolver shot. Another. Black Ike! He caught an instant's glimpse of the gunman's distorted face through the crowd. That was it, probably. A row over some mall. And then, as Jimmie Dale lunged up from his chair to his feet to escape the rush, pandemonium itself seemed to break loose. Yells, shots, screams, and oaths filled the air. The crowd surged this way and that. Tables were overturned and sent crashing to the floor. And then came sudden darkness, as some one of the attendants, in misguided excitability, switched off the lights. The darkness but served to increase the panic, not allay it. With a savage snap of his jaws, Jimmie Dale swung from his table in the corner with the intention of making his way out by a side door behind him. It was a case of the police again, and the patrolman outside would probably be pulling a riot call by now. And the police. He stopped suddenly, as though he had been struck. An envelope thrust there out of the darkness was in his hand, and her voice, hers, the Tocsin's, was sounding in his ears. Jimmie, I've been trying all evening to catch you. Quick, get to the sanctuary and change your clothes. There's not an instant to lose. It's for my sake tonight. And then a surging mob was around him on every side, and pushing, jostling, half lifting him at times from his feet, carried him forward with its rush, and with him in its midst burst through the door and out into the street. End of Part 2, Chapter 1. Recording by Roger Moline.